what reactions were you hoping for with those gifts?
Well, the giving of the gifts was a fun game.
Suicide Squad was the first DC film I came into watching with virtually no excitement. Okay, no, I was excited because I knew I was about to watch a massive train wreck unfold in front of my eyes. When Margot Robbie was cast as Harley, I was excited since I knew her from Wolf of Wall Street, but not much else at this point. And she definitely wasn't the star she is now, but it seemed like a solid choice, even if I didn't have a ton of fondness for the character at the time. Besides from the animated series, but since then she'd been kind of a fairly cringy character in the comics. Will Smith was cast as Deadshot, which kind of gave me a Sylvester Stallone as Judge Dredd vibes, but I get it, you need some star power. Finally, Jared Leto came out as Joker and I was floored. He looked like an absolute clown. A Joker. Words that you think would be endearing or even positive for an adaptation of the Joker, but what I mean by this is he looked like a total fucking asshole. I saw the movie, and it was exactly what I expected. It was bloated, boring, and looked horrendous. I thought it was absolutely awful at the time, and I thought it was irredeemable. But as time went on, I warmed up to some aspects, and definitely don't think it's the worst thing in the DCEU anymore, but it's still lacking pretty heavily. We'll get back to that later. The film started development back in 2009, but didn't really start rolling until David Ayer was hired on in 2014. The film initially featured Steppenwolf and the Enchantress before Steppenwolf had to be cut so they could use him in 2017's Justice League by Zack Snyder. Anyhow, this film is where I start getting my newest segment, Actors' Controversies. While Jared Leto's set antics are more weird than heinous, like later DCEU controversies occasionally were, they're still worth noting. Jared took his method acting, I put that in huge air quotes, in a different direction than most actors. Jared Leto saw the acclaim Heath Ledger got for Joker and figured the only way for a similar acclaim was to go method. Apparently he brought rats to set as a gift for Margot Robbie and gifted the cast a dead pig, on both occasions attributing the actions to Mr. J. It's cringe, but if you follow Jared Leto as a celebrity, it's not entirely surprising. There's also a lot of creepy stuff about Jared Leto, like him starting a cult and all that, but we'll ignore that for the time being and keep it relevant to Suicide Squad. Suicide Squad ended up having extensive reshoots that supposedly changed the last third of the movie fairly heavily, and was also designed to make teens get more into the Harley Quinn Joker romance and make it less abusive. I would guess, because these two characters were most likely the most marketable characters, making Joker abusive might affect merch sales and give people a bad taste in their mouth about this relationship, which by design should leave people with a bad taste in their mouth. The story of Suicide Squad goes as follows. Amanda Waller thinks the only way to fight the metahuman threats is by creating a team of metahumans she has full control over. Figuring she can create and control a covert team of supervillains who she plants bombs in as essentially blackmail to keep them in line, and being led by Rick Flag, an elite tactician, and the Enchantress, whose alter ego, June Moon, is dating Rick Flag. However, June's power is derived from being possessed by the evil Enchantress, and when her brother Incubus is revived after his spirit is released from a vial, Enchantress and Incubus threaten to destroy Midway City, so the Suicide Squad is assembled for their first time in an attempt to save Midway City and, potentially, the entire world from this threat. The film kind of puts the actual threat on the back burner to focus on the squad wandering around the city, chatting and fighting the Enchantress's minions a little bit. Finally, they do meet Incubus and Enchantress, and the group defeats them, but El Diablo is killed during the final battle, and the team learns what it means to be friends or something. And most of them never showed up again. Suicide Squad balances the team fairly well, surprisingly, giving everyone a decent piece of the spotlight, with the definitive star of the film being Deadshot, due primarily to the popularity of Will Smith and the importance of the character in the comic book. The other two primary characters are Rick Flag as well as Harley Quinn. Harley definitely has more going on with her Joker subplots than the actual squad, where she is in the background to Will Smith's Deadshot primarily. Deadshot, like I said, is probably the lead of the film. Deadshot gets incarcerated by the Batman after a slew of paid hits throughout Gotham. Deadshot is raising his daughter Zoe as a single father, up till his incarceration, and agrees to join the squad if he can get time off his sentence and they're willing to put Zoe in a nice college. The character is definitely just your average Will Smith role, being very sympathetic, perhaps to a fault, and in a lot of ways acting like the link between the squad and Rick Flag, their supervisor. Deadshot gets a lot of screen time, and his story stays more focused on the plot than Harley's, which sort of is all over the place. I like Will Smith enough. He doesn't have much range, and I don't feel this is a super great adaptation, but Will Smith quipping, being charming, and shooting guns is exactly what Will Smith should be doing in a film, and he's good at it, so I enjoyed the performance enough, even though typically we know how Will Smith's films do from a critical standpoint. Harley Quinn is introduced, being captured by the Batman after a car chase with her and the Joker. Harley was a former psychologist that falls in love with Jared Leto's dreamy yet effeminate version of the Joker. After helping him escape Arkham by somehow sneaking in goons with machine guns, a fact that's never explained, Joker initiates her to his world by transforming her into Harley Quinn after forcing her to bathe in some of the chemicals that created his Joker persona. Harley, at a couple points of the film, is joined by the Joker, once saved on a random rooftop escape while being in contact with her via cell phone she somehow has, and once at the end of the film where he daringly breaks her out of Arkham somehow with a gang of armed goons. Similar to how Harley Quinn somehow saved him from Arkham with a gang of armed goons, and it's never explained. Margot Robbie's performance here is a career low. Harley isn't well written in this movie, so most of what she says is cheesy and annoying, and Margot Robbie in 2016 had only done a few major roles and wasn't quite the star she is today, so they kind of forced her into the background, so she's both kind of reserved and randomly not reserved. It's kind of a weird balance, especially given the fact that in her subsequent appearances as Harley Quinn she does a fairly good job, but we'll come back to that later. I think her acting in general has gotten better as well, in fairness, but I never thought she was bad in anything other than this film, really. Amanda Waller doesn't have a ton of screen time, but she's essential to the film. She sets up the squad and pals around with a pre-blow-up David Harbour to work on Task Force X. Regardless, Waller starts the squad because she doesn't see metahumans being controllable through typical means and takes an unorthodox approach of solving the perceived metahuman era Superman ushered in post-Man of Steel. Waller is an interesting enough character, and while I don't think the film used the huge talent of Viola Davis to the extent they should have, I look forward to her in the future in James Gunn's DCEU, since she's one of the few actors jumping between franchises and supposedly getting her own TV show. Joker is portrayed by Jared Leto, and he is probably the most well-remembered part of this film, and not for the right reasons. I remember when the first image of Jared Leto as Joker came out, the comic book and film world were absolutely shaken, and rightfully so. After Heath Ledger's take, which was acclaimed as possibly the most memorable part of the Dark Knight trilogy and possibly the most memorable Joker, even above beloved actors such as Cesar Romero and Jack Nicholson before him, the question was, do they do something radically new or just emulate Heath? I also remember some people convinced the character should have been retired at the time. I was opposed to that, but I agree the next take should have been new. They perhaps overcorrected and went a little too new with Jared Leto's take, who they made a clean, well-kempt, slick, and romanticized crime boss over Heath's dirty, unkempt, awkward anarchist. Both are valid takes in a lot of ways, with Jared kind of following the more classic Joker crime boss format from the original comics. The thing that was kind of off-putting to people was the new character's aesthetics with grills, face tattoos, and a Joker who was well-dressed. The idea of him being very slick and flashy was kind of the inverse of what Heath did with his Joker. But the take isn't entirely invalid, as I said, with Joker in Batman 1 essentially being a slick, laid-back crime boss. And I think if the performance was really solid, it would have helped legitimize this version of Joker to the screen. But unfortunately, it was over the top most of the time and generally a little bit cringy. Didn't really give the best performance. I think Jared Leto just really overdid it. I think this version of the Joker probably should have been more reserved and quiet and just generally more subtle. Perhaps if that was the case, he could have won me over, but I still think he has an uphill battle winning over the audience, in part because his aesthetic is not exactly what we've come to expect from the Joker with Heath Ledger's version before. In the film, his primary role is to be Harley's love interest, and other than that, he kind of just pops up a few times. He seems to be kind of a pointless character, if I'm being honest, at least in the final theatrical cut. Apparently he had more stuff in the supposed Ayer cut. I'll come back to the Joker and Harley romance in its own section, but for now, let's move on from the Joker. The film didn't really know what to do with Captain Boomerang. He just kind of shows up and he says he robs banks, but to what end is he in the film? He doesn't really have much of an arc beyond kind of just throwing his boomerang in the background of action sequences. At one point, he tries planning a coup to have him and other Suicide Squad members escape, but he doesn't really have an arc in his own right. I suppose he's kind of a nihilist, but that's about all they really attempt to do with the character. El Diablo is tortured by the death of his family, who he accidentally cremates with his flame powers in a fit of rage. He feels a lot of remorse for what happened and is hesitant to join the squad because he doesn't want to hurt people anymore. I think he's one of the more interesting characters in the film, and Jay Hernandez, who plays the character, does a lot with the small amount of script he's given. I thought he was one of the better performances too, and elevated his character, who could have easily not stood out at all. Killer Croc, much like Captain Boomerang, is mostly in the movie for name recognition and to pad the roster, but also lacks a lot of things to do, similar to Captain Boomerang. The film implied he might have had a tragic backstory and stuff, but that doesn't really go anywhere within the film. Enchantress is kind of an obscure character, but what I love about DC is the amount of creative, obscure characters. Enchantress isn't really one of them. Nothing against the idea of the character, but the execution is just very weak here, as well as really in the original comics, but we'll come back to that. One thing I do love is the effect of her transforming from June into the Enchantress. It's a cool effect. Cara Delevingne kind of got a chance at acting between this and the Valerian movie, but never really made it. Don't get me wrong, as a model I'm sure she's great, but as an actress I never really liked her. She just seemed really bland. That probably wasn't helped in this film by the fact that she really didn't have much to do. But I think the June Moon character needs more tragedy to make her being possessed mean more. But she seems more like a prop for the movie. And also for some reason Cara Delevingne's acting feels like porno acting, where I'm not really buying what she's selling. As a villain, the Enchantress is pretty weak too. She barely shows up, and I find myself forgetting she's even in the movie because she disappears from the movie for several scenes before coming back and just kind of being there. And all we really know about the Enchantress is that she's really evil and stuff, and she brings back her brother so they can take over the world or whatever. But we just never get any villainous motivation, and Enchantress and Incubus are both pretty lame villains that really don't have much going on beyond their aesthetics. It's pretty lame. Also, the final confrontation in a dusty alley and seeing virtually no human consequences makes me wonder if this is actually as big of a threat as the movie says it is. Alright, we're gonna go more into the comic book adaptions and stuff from here. So let's look at the history of a bunch of these characters, shall we? The Suicide Squad first appeared as a team of soldiers in Brave and the Bold 25, led by Rick Flag, who ran the team along with a handful of other characters to give their lives to save others. However, the first supervillain version of the team was created for Suicide Squad number 1 in 1987, which is the version that has been maintained in the years following, led by the only returning member of the original Suicide Squad, Rick Flag, and overseen by Amanda Waller. Deadshot first appeared in Batman 59 from 1950. Originally, he was a campy villain wearing a tuxedo and a top hat with a domino mask, before being reinvented in Detective Comics 474 with the more modern look, aesthetic, and feel. In the movie, Deadshot has a daughter he loves, and all that. In the comics, he's just kind of some hired gun guy that wants Batman dead really bad. Will Smith's version is definitely more of an anti-hero than the comics one, who's just kind of a dick. But anyways, Joker first appeared in Batman number 1, where he was basically just a gangster who wanted to kill Batman before becoming more of a comedian in the Silver Age, and eventually more of a serial killer in the 70s and 80s. He is another character with many different variations. Leto's variation was definitely a miscalculation. It leaned more into the gangster roots of the character than ever before, giving an almost South American cartel vibe for some reason, which I think was an odd take, but kind of an interesting modernization of the 1940s gangster aesthetic potentially. And really, the way that they managed to modernize it, I feel like just came off a little cringe-inducing. And it feels like they wanted to do something different from past iterations to the point where it comes off a little bit ridiculous. I feel like in a lot of ways, I don't think it's invalid to greatly reinvent DC characters. I mean, we see it a lot in these movies. But much like Jesse Eisenberg's take on Lex Luthor from Batman v Superman, this just felt like more of a miscalculation than anything. Harley Quinn first appeared in the Batman the Animated Series episode, Joker's Favor, where she appeared as Joker's abused girlfriend and starts off as more of a named henchman before eventually becoming popular enough in the show and in fan communities to appear in the comics 7 years later in 1999, to the point where she's become so popular that now she has her own show and is almost arguably more popular than the Joker in wider pop culture these days. However, as time went on, she began to transition more into an anti-hero from just a villain, and appeared less and less with the Joker himself, and more with characters like Poison Ivy and Catwoman. Harley Quinn is another case of cross-pollination. She first appeared in the cartoons before coming to the comics, then into the movies, where her character was expanded and evolved, only to then be moved back into the cartoons with her new and fairly popular HBO series that's been pretty successful in its own right, ironically. Anyhow, Margot Robbie's version is so important to the character's history, it's impossible to remove her from the modern versions of the character, putting her up there with people like Alan Napier, who played Alfred, and influenced the character, and helped cement them into the popular consciousness beyond the comic fans. This is not to downplay the contributions of people like Paul Dini, Tara Strong, or of course Arlene Sorkin, Quinn's initial voice actress, but it's hard to also downplay Margot Robbie's eventual influence on the character. Katana started in Brave and the Bold number 200 from 1988 and is a frequent member of Batman's offshoot team, The Outsiders, as well as the Birds of Prey and the Suicide Squad on occasion. She took on a larger role, being essentially the Robin of the universe of Beware the Batman, which was a real short-lived 3D Batman animated series made by Cartoon Network in 2013. Rick Flag premiered in Brave and the Bold 25 and hasn't changed much over the years, with Suicide Squad's version maintaining the idea. He's a patriotic overseer of the Suicide Squad, and he's a really good tactician, and he's really good at shooting guns. He's not too hard to adapt over. Amanda Waller first appeared in Legends number 1 from 1986. She's most well known as a government agent who leads the Suicide Squad, and Viola Davis does a great job playing that hard-ass role, while also acting heartless when needed in order to save the world. She is, in a lot of ways, the antithesis of many of the superheroes of the universe trying to fight villains in her own brutal and arguably villainous ways. Captain Boomerang first appeared in Flash 117 in 1960 and was one of the Flash's primary foes, often leading his rogues gallery against the Flash in the various assaults on Central City. The film version also fought the Flash, but was most well known for his time in the Suicide Squad, which makes sense since he was a founding member of the modern Suicide Squad in the comics version. It's a shame we didn't see more of him in the Flash, but that character kind of had a rough and turbulent history throughout the DCEU, so a brief 3-second cameo where we see the Flash beat up Captain Boomerang is probably all we'll ever see. El Diablo was created in All-Star Western number 2 where he was a hero. Lazarus Lane, the first villainous version, and what the movie seems to be based on, is Chateau Santana, a character that originated in El Diablo Volume 3, Number 1, and was eventually made into a member of the Suicide Squad with his reintroduction in Suicide Squad Number 1 for the DC New 52. He is a relatively new character, being created in 2008, and to this day hasn't been expanded much in the DC canon, beyond his brief tenure in the 2011 version of the Suicide Squad. Killer Croc was created in Detective Comics 523 and was essentially DC's answer to the Lizard from Spider-Man. Killer Croc was a human named Waylon Jones who had a disease that made him into a crocodile. The movie is fairly faithful to these origins. While Killer Croc isn't the most common Suicide Squad member in the comics, he's occasionally affiliated with the team. Enchantress first appeared in Strange Adventures number 187, where she gains her powers in a magical fortress. Forgotten by the publisher for years due to her lack of popularity, she eventually returned as a villain later on, and joined the Suicide Squad along with several other group members. Her origins are similar, and the ideas of the ancient Enchantress taking over June Moon's body, when she says Enchantress, has been cooked into the comics for a long time. Admittedly, didn't know much about this character. She's mainly been a supporting player in the Suicide Squad comics line, and I never really read much Suicide Squad, admittedly. Incubus is a short-lived character in the comics, premiering in Suicide Squad 14 from 1988 and dying the following issue. In the comics, he was the brother of Succubus, but they retooled him into being the brother of Enchantress for the film. In both, he's a villain that goes against the Squad. In the comics, he's brought down by Deadshot. Slipknot is a Firestorm villain. Neither character seemed to get much love in the expanded media. In the movie, Slipknot is introduced and quickly killed. In the comics, he briefly joined the Suicide Squad, but was mostly not important. Musically, the film is scored by Stephen Prince, who previously worked on David Ayer's film Fury before jumping to the Suicide Squad with him. The film, however, has a lot of licensed tracks and original songs it uses ad nauseum. And all of the licensed songs are such major tracks that it's distracting. On top of the new songs like Heathen, Sucker for Pain, and Purple Lamborghini, we also see a plethora of songs from a variety of genres seemingly mashed into this movie in an attempt to cover up for the lack of plot. Songs like The Ballroom Blitz, The House of the Rising Sun, Super Freaks, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, Fortunate Son, Paranoid, Seven Nation Army, Without Me, Black Skinhead, and Bohemian Rhapsody are just a handful of songs I personally know off the top of my head from while writing this. A strange mix of songs that don't really add much to the tone and are thematically random. A few days before seeing this film, I was at a branch of the American Legion, rocking out to a top 40 cover band along with the geezers that frequent the bar. And they were playing all sorts of random hits from a variety of genres. And it reminded me of this film because it's just a bunch of shit with no musical thesis. Like, how does this connect? It's kind of fun when you say, oh, I recognize that song. Then you start to wonder what the music is actually supposed to be saying in relation to the plot. Anyways, I review all of the DCEU soundtrack albums at the end of my full retrospective series, so if you're watching this in a single part, stay tuned for that, because I'm surely going to forget to edit this out. If you're here in the full video, hi, thanks. In like a few hours, we'll be getting to that, so stay tuned. Much later in the video. The cinematography, again, is a step above Marvel's in-house style, feeling like its own thing, which a lot of these films in early DC do very well. There are also some little creative shots and cuts, like when Deadshot shoots a target several times and it creates a little hole that the camera pans through. The color correction looks pretty solid too, for the most part, early on. I will say, once they journey through Midway, it begins to look a little more boring location-wise, and the movie looks a little swampy at points. Overall, though, the film looks decent to me, but certainly could have been better, and I think in Midway they should have added like some neon signs or something to kind of tone it up, make it a little more creative looking, because Midway City just looks bland. Tonally, I don't get what they're going for. Occasionally the film tries to be funny, occasionally the film is dramatic, and occasionally it tries to be romantic. Confused themes can often happen in films like this, which have a larger ensemble cast, but don't actually thread the plotline very well. It's not surprising that it ended up this way though, especially given the disturbingly bad practices employed in the editing room. After the movie was shot and completed, John Gilroy, who edited the similarly chopped up Star Wars Rogue One, as well as Nightcrawler, which was directed by his twin brother Dan, was assigned to the editor chair. Though he left the film before completion, he was credited as the final editor of the film, which is kind of shitty for them to do, since the movie ended up being edited like shit. However, despite the credit, Lee Smith, who is a frequent collaborator of Christopher Nolan and Sam Mendes, working on franchises like the Dark Knight trilogy and James Bond, was hired to make a cut. When Focus Group watched his cut, it was determined to be too dark, and Warner Brothers executives forced some more extensive reshoots, as well as adding a new editor. The person who edited the final cut is unconfirmed. It is not Lee Smith or John Gilroy. After the film came out, however, it was rumored that a ghost editor wasn't even a single person. Rather, they pushed it to a trailer house which edited the final theatrical film we got. This may explain why it is so stuffed with licensed tracks, a lot of which seem more like trailer songs than subtle background checks set to play during intimate scenes between characters. And also things like a heavy reliance on title cards and graphics. Editors always get the short end of the stick in Hollywood, frequently being integral to the film's success and rarely getting the credit they actually deserve. So yeah, that's probably why the movie looks the way it does, is because it wasn't actually edited by a real editor. They fired those guys and replaced them with a trailer house. This film is the first DC movie to have an end credits scene, and it teases the next core part of the DCEU, the Justice League franchise, with Bruce Wayne urging Amanda Waller to take a step back and let him and his fellow metahumans take care of humanity's threats. This ended up being a light tease for the upcoming Justice League film and also established the difference between Amanda Waller's Suicide Squad and Bruce's planned Justice League. I already mentioned a lot of the good stuff I liked about this movie previously in the video, but to recap, there are some shots that I think are pretty creative, like Enchantress's transformation and Will Smith shooting through that target. It also looks pretty decent until the squad's journey through Midway City, which I think was probably partially in the lighting. I think there should have been more creative lighting. Midway in the comics never really gets a personality to set it apart from like Gotham or Metropolis. Amanda Waller, Deadshot, El Diablo, and Batman are all pretty well performed by their respective actors, with Batman especially getting more Batman-like moments post-BVS, which is really needed to kind of try to humanize that character after they made him super dark and edgy in Batman vs. Superman. And while Deadshot, portrayed by Will Smith, was just Will Smith, it's occasionally fun to see Will Smith playing up in his full 90s Will Smith glory, which we definitely don't see as much as we used to, and it's always kind of fun. El Diablo, as portrayed by Jay Hernandez, is also a standout, especially given that he's basically a background character used to pad the roster. Also, being the only character in this film to really have any sort of substantial and satisfying arc of any kind. Even with the few things I was generally positive on, there's still a lot of issues. Some of it comes back down to the editing and studio interference, and some of it seemed to just be baked into the script that was written by the screenwriters, and even some decisions I think David Ayer is responsible for, despite the movie being kind of removed from him and his chosen editor's hands. From an editing end, we had the added title cards, while Amanda Waller explains who each character is via narration. While this framework probably saves quite a bit of time from the already 2-hour and 15-minute extended cut of the movie, it feels like a bit of a cheap way to introduce characters quickly. The scenes showing these introductions seem to be cut from a more complete film as well, which makes them feel like movie clips more than new content, if that makes sense. The editors also cut in so much music that it's kind of distracting due to it either being well-known music or tracks you'd more likely use in a trailer. It feels like they're trying to divert attention from the movie for some reason. There also isn't a solid framing device, a la Guardians of the Galaxy and Peter's Walkman or Zoom, that explains why we're hearing all of these pop songs, and sometimes very popular pop songs. Some of the characters are a little generic looking in the film. I think the primary two that come to mind are Killer Croc and Incubus, both of whom I would hope more from. Killer Croc could have been gnarly and really cool looking, but ultimately what we got was a guy in face paint and some prosthetics. He looks more like the lizard guy from Ripley's Believe It or Not than a menacing monstrosity. Also, if people forgot Incubus was in the movie, they'd be totally forgiven. On top of doing very little, he just looks lame and like a very cheap version of Steppenwolf from Justice League, who also looks kinda shitty, by the way. It just wasn't an ideal formula. I guess on the flip side of the underdesigns, Joker was a little overdesigned. I also like how Amanda is about to send out the Suicide Squad. She gives each of them their specific uniform back, and didn't have tactical gear ready for them for this military operation. Harley Quinn, for example, dresses in booty shorts and a t-shirt. A person who I guess is good at hand-to-hand combat and not much else was given a t-shirt and fucking booty shorts. They also gave her back her cell phone for some reason, which she frequently texts the Joker on, and leads to the Joker finding her midway through the movie and her escaping for like 2 seconds. I just don't understand the logic behind this, except brand recognition. At least Deadshot's uniform has some tactical advantages, presumably, despite the one eye thing probably affecting his depth perception, which you would think he would need as a sharpshooter, but whatever. We have a lot of flimsy and bad dialogue, mostly coming from Harley Quinn and Joker, but also to an extent from Deadshot, with his classic line, "What are we? Some kind of Suicide Squad?"
So that's it? What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
The plot also needs some major work too. We established the Enchantress, then, when her brother Incubus is reincarnated, she just kinda hides in a dark alley and starts making nameless minions for the squad to occasionally fight throughout the movie. The minions are also weak looking. They remind me of the putties from Power Rangers, like Mighty Morphin. I'm not talking about the movie from 2017, I mean the fucking putties, man. We have 5 costumes and they're gonna do some karate against them. It looks like shit. When we finally do see the battle, pitting the squad against Enchantress and Incubus, it ends up being a laser light show that plays out in a boring alley in a boring city. Since these characters were dropped into a movie with pretty much no plot, they don't really do much but shoot shit for the entirety of the Midway City battle. Also, choosing DC's Detroit and adding no personality to it, but being kinda dumpy, leads the city to feeling generic. I get why they picked the city, since it's home of Hawkman and Doom Patrol, neither of whom have been established in the DCEU at this point, which explains why no one else ever pulls up to help the squad. DC has a lot of fictional heroes. Most of them have some personality in the comics, but DC's primary goal is to just have a name for a city for people to jump around in. Gotham has a lot of heroes, and a lot of Batman stories deepen the Gotham myth. Not saying Midway City has nothing going on for it, but why not make it like Atlantic City or Vegas, like casinos and lights and whatever? That would have fit tonally well with the Suicide Squad's bright personas and stuff, and the war-torn Midway City is definitely more of a holdover from the darker early drafts, but Midway is basically a blank canvas. Just make some shit up to make it look more interesting as they travel around it. I don't usually read off my chapter sections. I kind of break my videos down into chapters, if that makes sense, but I'm going to read this title because I think it's poignant. Joker and Harley's Relationship and Hot Topic 2. That's what I call this part. And I'm going to explain why. I wanted to finish wrapping up this Suicide Squad retrospective by taking a bit more of a look into Joker and Harley's relationship, which I think is absolutely terrible. Unlike the original Batman the Animated Series show and the comics, and the actual intent behind their relationship, nothing in this movie really talks about the larger thesis of Joker and Harley's relationship, which is that Joker essentially abuses Harley Quinn. And it doesn't really say anything about domestic abuse at all, mostly romanticizing the two characters and trying to make it for the teenagers watching this film to buy merchandise from Hot Topic and make them think this type of relationship is a normal thing. It's obviously kind of a modern play of the more romanticized versions of the life of Bonnie and Clyde, but the thing about Bonnie and Clyde is their story ends with them getting shot the hell up, and that's a real story. However, real life is often more poetically satisfying than film. Joker and Harley as an abusive couple was first expanded on in Mad Love, which was written and penciled by Harley Quinn creators Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, in the Batman Adventures Mad Love one-shot from 1994. A comic that was so good it won the 1994 Eisner Award for the best single issue of the year. The Eisner Awards are basically the comics industry's Oscars, so this was a very prestigious award, especially as it takes a lot to stand out as a single comic issue in the sea of thousands of comic issues per year coming out from major publishers. In the issue, Harley decides that the reason Joker is so terrible to her and refuses to settle down is because Batman, who Harley is convinced wrongfully, targets the Joker, so she hatches a plan to kill him. The book is amazing, like a lot of Bruce Timm and Paul Dini work. The book was later made into an episode of the new Batman Adventures, aka Batman the Animated Series Season 3, if we go by the classifications for the Batman the Animated Series complete sets. Anyways, we see the Joker hitting Harley and being genuinely terrible to her.
Don't you want to rev up your Harley?
Harley finally smartens up and leaves the Joker, but then he sends her flowers, which causes her to fall in love with him again. As time goes on, this idea would expand, but the idea that the Joker is a terrible partner to Harley is baked into the identity of her character. My issue with the Suicide Squad is that the film mostly romanticizes her relationship with the Joker, and never actually does anything to condemn it or comment on how Harley is clearly kind of the victim of the Joker, like it's implied in the show and the comics. Harley and the Joker are stylish, rich, and devious. Joker even kills a crime boss, Monster T, for messing with Harley. They drive around to romantic pop music in Joker's neon purple Lamborghini, and romantic music and slow motion being employed to make Harleen's transformation into Harleen more romanticized than, oh, that's kind of messed up that Joker would throw her into a vat of chemicals to make her more like him. The only real hint we get in the movie that Joker's a dick is when he crashes his Lamborghini in the river. Harley said she can't swim, and it's kind of a blink and you miss it moment. But when Joker makes not one but two attempts to save Harley, each time the film framing it as a big romantic gesture, you start to question what the final film and Warner Brothers were actually trying to get the audience to think about this relationship. Again, I don't really blame David Ayer for this, because this kind of wasn't his film at all. The film doesn't do anything to cleverly comment on this relationship. Rather, they hope to make them an it couple for kids, so they would LARP around as Harley and Joker and sell splat hair dye and other products that can be purchased at Hot Topic. Warner supposedly wanted to downplay the abuse stuff to market Joker and Harley to kids with products like Joker trench coat, Harley Quinn costume, Harley Quinn cocktail dress, Joker card hoodie, Joker blazer with unzippable smile sleeve, Harley's put-in choker, Harley's property of Joker's sports jacket, Harley Quinn pudding booty shorts, Harley Quinn officially licensed sequins panties, a series of Harley Quinn's Daddy's Little Monster t-shirts. My point of all this is to illustrate that there were so many monetary reasons that Warner Brothers wanted to completely forgo the more abusive stuff in Joker and Harley's relationship, and it's because you can't get teenage girls to want to buy Superman sequins panties. I don't think Hot Topic even offers any underwear based on Superman, but Harley, on the other hand, is infinitely monetizable to confused preteens. They understand that Hot Topic can get kids to dress in the Joker Fox crocodile skin duster or Harley's Daddy's Little Monster t-shirt with a $40 MSRP. And if they're lucky, they'll also sell the matching $85 property of Joker jacket. And if they're really cranking, they can even upsell a $45 pair of sequenced panties to maximize profits. I don't have Hot Topic's numbers, but they still to this day sell lots of Harley Quinn merch, lots of Joker merch, and lots of Suicide Squad merch. Perhaps there was something behind this. Maybe Warner Brothers made a really smart executive move in deciding, let's not actually follow the thesis of these characters and rather do something completely opposed to the actual intent of the filmmakers and the creators of the characters in order to make a bunch of money. So, that's pretty much Suicide Squad in a nutshell. But, the Suicide Squad album did pretty good, selling more than 2 million copies in the US, which tells me that Joker and Harley's relationship, while not emotionally satisfying or well written, clearly made Warner Brothers a bunch of money. It also led to DC greenlighting numerous Harley Quinn spin-off films, and a couple of Joker ones, which we'll eventually come back to in my project based on canceled DC films, which will also be in the larger video if you're watching this version, so stay tuned for that. Watching Suicide Squad now, I dislike it, but I don't totally hate it, I guess. I just passively think it's pretty bad. Joker is a huge misstep, but might have been okay, even with his odd design choice, if they had simply had Jared Leto dial it back and play it just slightly different. The type of Joker he plays should be a little more reserved, like Jack Nicholson's take, you know? You have those crazy moments, but a lot of the time he's just a kind of a reserved and smart gangster guy. I like most of the squad, but Harley was weaker than in her future installments, admittedly. The villain plot is paper thin, and the Joker and Harley relationship was, I think, a huge cash grab, and kinda thematically went against the comic books in every way. The movie looks okay, but certainly could have looked a bit better if they did more to make Midway City look a little more unique. Overall, I'd pass on this film, but it has some points in the film that shine through over the absolute shit that makes up most of the film. Suicide Squad earned $747 million on a budget of $175 million, meaning it earned approximately $4 million in profit, and was probably the highest profit the DCEU made for a film up to this point. However, it had the worst reviews to this point as well, with 26% on Rotten Tomatoes and 40 out of 100 on Metacritic. A lot of critics calling the film things like ugly and boring, which is something I don't disagree with. And Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn was praised as great casting, but in contrast, Jared Leto's Joker was seen as a bad choice. From an award standpoint, it actually did better, winning an Oscar for Best Makeup, which doesn't say much about the film's story quality, but that's something. Congratulations to the people who worked hard to make the makeup really happen for this movie. The award also was echoed at the Makeup Guild Awards, where it won Best Makeup in a Feature Film. Margot Robbie also won the Critics' Choice Awards for Best Actress in an Action Film. She won the same award at the People's Choice Awards as well. So I guess some people liked Margot Robbie's performance, despite the fact that I clearly didn't see it. While these are small wins, it still reflects that Robbie was the best part of the film, at least for the critics, and that the makeup was good, which I can agree with, I guess, but I'm no expert in the field. Despite the critical reception being poor, Warner Brothers would start production on several spin-offs based on the Harley character, as well as beginning a sequel, which would ultimately come out much later under the title of The Suicide Squad, which would be directed by James Gunn.